If you're preparing your ISE III topic presentation, there are some ideas that you should be clear about. So what I'm trying to do is I'm just going to try and help you structure your presentation correctly and try to use appropriate language for a presentation. Remember your presentation, your topic presentation should be 4 minutes long, and after it you're going to have another 4 minutes where the examiner will ask you questions and somehow will discuss your topic with you. So it's going to be 8 minutes in total, but you need to plan for 4 minutes presentation. So when planning your presentation, you should bear these things in mind. For example, what is your purpose? What is your intention when preparing that topic? What's your point going to be? What's your contention going to be along your presentation? This is very important. You need to be discursive. Your presentation shouldn't be just a description of something and that's it. No, you should think of a topic that has two sides of the argument. So, on the one hand, you can show both sides of the argument, even if you're picking one side in particular. But then, if it is a topic that can be argued in favor or against, then the examiner can later take issue with you, discuss it, take the other side of the argument, and will be able to ask you further questions. If you're simply describing something, he or she won't be able to do that. And then, what are the main points you want to make? What are the main ideas you want to discuss in your presentation? So yes, what is your main point? Try to find a discursive topic, something with two sides of the argument, and then think of the points you want to make. When you start your exam, you should give a handout to the examiner with just the main points of your presentation. That way, he or she can follow what you're saying. If you have no support, it's going to be more complicated for them to follow you. And besides, with that handout, it will be easier for them to think of questions and comments they can make for the discussion afterwards. Think of a title and introduce the subject properly. What I mean by properly is that you should be saying from the start, from the onset, you should be saying exactly what you're going to speak about. So situate the subject, place or time or relation to the examiner, or maybe the importance of your topic. So give a rough idea, and you can use language such as this. You could say something like, in my presentation, I intend to speak about, or the subject of my presentation is, or because it is 4 minutes long, you could say, over the next 4 minutes, I'm going to talk about, or I'm going to discuss whether, that could be a good idea. Because when you say whether, you're saying whether or. So you're giving the two sides of the argument. So you could say that, over the next 4 minutes, I'm going to discuss whether this is relevant or not, for example. In your introduction, you could also say, explain the reasons why you chose that particular topic. You could say, I have chosen to speak about this because I have chosen to discuss this topic, whatever it may be, because, or the main reasons why I'm discussing this, whatever, are, and whatever your reasons may be. We're going to be talking about structure, and we're going to be talking about signposting, giving indications, giving clear indications of where your presentation is going. So, again, it could be very nice for you to say at the beginning of your presentation, to say, I have divided my presentation into 2 different parts, or I have divided my presentation into 3 parts, or however many parts you might have. In the first part, I'll give a few basic definitions, or in the first part, I'll argue why this should be implemented. In the next section, I will explain blah, blah, blah. In part 3, I'll show some examples of, and in the last part, I would like to give whatever, you can do whatever you want with it, but try and make your structure clear from the start. And of course, it should be the same structure as you have indicated in the handout that the examiner is following. Because this is an oral presentation, it is especially important for you to make the transitions between your introduction and the different parts of your presentation, the body of your presentation. You have to do that in writing as well. However, in writing, you have the visual help of separating paragraphs. You don't have that when speaking. So with your intonation and with some discourse markers, you need to make the transition clear. But at the same time smoother, so don't change from one thing to another abruptly. So when you finish your introduction, you could say things like, now let us turn to point 1. When you move to the next section, let us now move on to the second part, which is, as I said earlier, as I said before. So things like that, to have a relation between all your parts, all your sections, but at the same time indicating clearly that you're moving from one part of the presentation to another. About the quantity of information you should be giving. Should you give too much or too little? What you need to think is enough information to clearly develop your ideas so that the other person will understand what you're saying. But just bear in mind that you have 4 minutes and you need to finish your presentation with introduction, development and conclusion in your 4 minutes. As I said, it is essential for you to signpost the information, to give clear indications. Imagine it's as if you were giving instructions to someone who's driving through a road they don't know. So the examiner doesn't know where you're going, so you're giving indications. So for example, you might list information and say things such as, there are 3 aspects to be taken into account, or 3 aspects that need to be taken into account. And so you mention them, 1, 2, 3, ABC, whatever. Marking the transition, you could say, now let us look at the first aspect, which is blah, blah, blah. You could say, first of all, whatever, or in the first place, blah, 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 whatever. Because you need to link ideas and mark the transitions, you could also indicate the end of one section and the beginning of a following one. So you could say something like, that's all I would like to say about whatever, and now let's move on to whatever. Another possibility could be to say, now that we've seen this, let us turn to, I don't know, now that we've seen the impact of this, let us turn to ways of solving this problem. You could also say, I'll move on now to my next section, which is, or turning now to blah, blah, blah. Again, indicating clearly where you're going and related to the points you made in your handout. Try to be clear and specific. And in order to do that, you could either use examples, rephrase, or summarize your information. So there are different ways for you to give an example. You could say, an example of this can be found, and then you give the example. You could say, to illustrate this, blah, blah, blah. Or, let's see this through an example. Or, now, let's take an example. Imagine if you're mentioning, I don't know, if I mention different pop groups, I could talk about the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Queen, to mention but a few. So you mention the examples, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Queen, to mention but a few. Or you could name the examples and say, namely, I'm referring to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Namely, it could be something like, specifically, in particular, I'm referring to. Some expressions you could use to rephrase, so to explain in different words what you've just said. So you could use, in other words, that is to say, what I mean to say is, or my point is, when you feel that you haven't made yourself 100% clear or just want to emphasize your idea, you can rephrase it using some of these expressions. In other words, that is to say, what I mean to say is, or my point is. If you want to summarize, you could use expressions such as to summarize, to sum up, in conclusion, or in short. If there's a particular idea you want to emphasize, these are some of the expressions you could use. You could say the most important or the most relevant factor is, the most important aspect is. You could say what is really significant is whatever. What is important to remember is that. You could also say, I'd like to emphasize the fact that these groups have always been blah 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 whatever, or I'd like to stress the importance of British pop music. It is really it's a good recommendation for you to refer to what you have said previously. So you can say, as I have said before, or I have said previously. To repeat what I've said already. Or what you can do as well is to refer to what you're going to say next in the next section of your presentation or a bit later on. So you could say something like that. We will see this a little later on. You could say, this will be the subject of part 3. You could say, I will go into more detail on that later. Or expressions such as for now or for the time being, enough for you to know that maybe if it's a very complicated subject that could need a lot of explanation and you don't have the time, enough for you to know that you don't need to know any more than that. That's just enough information for you to know. For now, for the time being, enough for you to know that. If you want to mention an expert or a pundit or something like that, you could say, according to that person, according to Einstein, according to Leonardo da Vinci, in the words of Elton John, or here I'd like to quote the person, as Mr. Whoever says in his book, blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, there is a famous quotation, or there is a famous quote that goes, instead of saying that says, that goes. It is an interesting idea as well to somehow involve your audience, in this case the examiner, to involve them in what you're saying. So you might refer to things that people probably know. And then you can say, as you may know, you may say, it is generally accepted that, or as you are probably aware, again, remember you're trying to catch the examiner's attention and you want to keep them interested somehow. One way to do that is to use rhetorical questions. Things such as, have you ever seen, have you ever heard, have you ever experienced? How can we explain this? We're not exactly asking them, we're not expecting an answer. It's just ways to attract their attention, and then probably we're going to answer ourselves. How can we explain this? What does that mean? What is the importance of? What are the consequences of? How can we possibly help? How can this be solved? Things like that, and then probably it's you that's going to give the answer to those questions. But it's a way to somehow signpost and mark clearly the parts of your presentation and somehow emphasize and make it more lively, more active. This is essential, and you need to remember this. However good your presentation might have been, you need to keep it under 4 minutes. You mustn't do it 2 minutes long, no. It has to be a proper presentation. So 3 minutes 40, 3 minutes 50, okay. If you go over the 4 minutes, when your 4 minutes are up, the examiner is going to interrupt you. And if you haven't reached your conclusion, then it might be a real problem, a very serious problem. So you really need to reach your conclusion. And you should reach your conclusion, you must have led to it somehow. There must be a logical development of your ideas. So it should never come as a surprise. When students just finish the presentation and say, and that's it. No, you should see that coming. There should be introduction, development of your points, and then a clear conclusion. So, different ways to signpost that you're reaching the conclusion. You could say, in conclusion, I would like to say that, or to sum up, in my view, whatever. Some other expressions, you could say, all things considered, blah, blah, blah. This is just to summarize again. You could say, all in all, or by and large, something like in general, or generally speaking then, or I like to summarize, or I'd like to sum up by saying, blah, blah, blah. Once you have delivered the whole of your topic presentation, you have to thank the examiner for listening to you. And then you need to invite questions and comments from the examiner. You need to do that, okay? In your 4 minutes. So you need these 10 seconds to do that inside your time. So you could say things like, thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions you'd like to ask. Or, thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Or, if there are any suggestions or comments, I'd be delighted to discuss them with you. These are just ideas, but as I said, you need to thank the examiner and invite questions and comments in your 4 minutes. So just 4 or 5 things for you to remember when you're preparing your topic presentation. My first advice would be for you to rehearse your presentation to yourself in front of a mirror, and especially time yourselves. This is essential. If you want to rehearse in front of an audience of friends, relatives, whatever, I don't know, totally up to you. You can also come to tutorials and rehearse your presentation with us. You have to try and be clearly understood, and use an appropriate tone of voice. The examiner must be able to hear you and understand what you're saying. He or she is not going to interrupt you if they don't understand, but obviously if they can't understand what you're saying, that's going to be a problem. Something which is essential as well, probably you're going to be using 5, 6, 7 words, the most important words of your topic. So those keywords, they're going to appear over and over again along your presentation. Imagine if you pronounce them incorrectly, or if the intonation is not right, then they won't be understood. Or even if they are understood, they will make you look really bad. So because there will be words that are going to be repeated over and over again, look up the pronunciation and the intonation. Make sure that, everything should be pronounced correctly because you have prepared it, but especially those keywords. They need to have perfect pronunciation and intonation. If you go to any online dictionary, you can click on the word and you have both the pronunciation and intonation. And if you're talking about people, place names or whatever, you can go to places like forvo.com, and native speakers have recorded themselves pronouncing those words. From experience, I can tell you that when you're preparing your presentation at home, my advice would be for you to do it in around 3 minutes 30, 3 minutes 40 maximum. Because on the day of the exam, you're going to be more nervous, you're going to have hesitations. So if you do it at home around 3:30, 3:40, then you will take 4 minutes on the day of the exam. If at home you're doing it in 4 minutes, then on the exam, it will take you longer and you won't be able to finish, probably. And then the last piece of advice I can give you is that very likely in your exam, you will be able to look at the time. You will know how long you're taking you will have probably a tablet or just a clock showing you the time. So if at some moment you feel that time's running up and you're not going to be able to finish your presentation, try and skip something in the middle. Try and get rid of some examples, something which is not relevant. Prepare something that could be got rid of, but you need to say your conclusion. That is essential. You need to finish and have reached your conclusion. This is something I'm saying over and over again. It's not just a question of delivering a presentation. You need to deliver a topic presentation at C1 level. And you have to impress the examiner. You have to leave them thinking, wow, that was good. That was very nice vocabulary. There were lots of very nice grammar expressions and language functions being shown. So, because you need to impress them, try and use vocabulary and grammar at C1 level, not a correct B2 topic presentation. That could be for B2 or something different. But you need to impress them with your C1 language level. Last but not least, you can prepare your 4-minute topic presentation and then you have an extra 4 minutes discussion with the examiner. You don't know what kinds of questions the examiner is going to ask you. We can't tell you, unfortunately. But you can somehow anticipate what kind of questions you're going to get asked, what kind of vocabulary you might be needing. So try and think of that. Try and come up with a list of words, or I don't know, what kinds of questions somebody who's listened to your presentation might be asking. So yeah, you might get it right or they might be completely different, but at least you might have prepared something and it won't catch you off guard. You can always ask us questions when you're preparing your presentation. You can show it to us. We can suggest improvements, things you could change, or maybe for you to make it a bit more discursive. So let's keep in touch. We'll be more than happy to help you with this.